Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucy Myers. I'm the Managing Director of art book publishers Lund Humphreys, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of Martin Kemp's book, Visions of Heaven, Dante and the Art of Divine Light. The book is published today, which is Dante Day, a national day in Italy celebrating the great poet. And it's also a day which has special resonance this year because we're also celebrating the 700th anniversary of Dante's death in 1321. So to celebrate both the launch of the book and the Dante anniversary, I'm delighted that we have a very distinguished panel of experts assembled to discuss the key themes of the book today. Thank you very much to our panelists Martin Kemp, Simon Gilson and Alessandra Buccheri for joining us today. I will be introducing them individually in a moment. But firstly, I'd like to introduce the book and to thank some key people involved in its production. Most importantly, a very big thank you to Martin Kemp for a really extraordinary achievement. It's a hugely ambitious project linking the medieval science of seeing, Dante's poetry, and some of the most celebrated masterpieces of Renaissance and Baroque art in a study of how visual artists following Dante address the challenge of how to depict unseeable heavenly light. The book succeeds on so many levels, but for me, I think that one of those is that it really makes you look again at the details of familiar masterpieces informed by Dante. But it also never loses the thread of the bigger themes. And it finishes with a meditation on one of the biggest themes of all, the limits of the knowable. The book is also particularly rich on account of its illustrations of the works of art discussed, including details of them which very much enhance the points made in the text. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Sandra Asserson, our picture researcher, who did a formidable job of sourcing the 100+ illustrations for the book during pandemic lockdown last summer. I'd also like to mention the excellent team who worked on the production of the book and managed it in record time. Copy editor Louise Tucker, proofreader Kate Parker, designer Lucy Warboys, and Judd Flogdale, Martin Kemp's PA, who has been very supportive throughout the project and also compiled the index for the book. The book is available to buy now. You can buy it from our website, lundhumphreys.com, and we have a special launch discount of 20% off the full price of £45, which you can claim by entering the code Dante Day 20 when you check out on the website. There's also free UK postage. That offer is only valid until the 31st of March, so don't miss the opportunity. And now to introduce our event, we will start with a presentation by Martin Kemp himself, who will be introducing the themes of the book in a short visual tour of it, which will be interspersed with some recordings of readings of Dante's poetry. And I'm very grateful to Dante Ceruolo, Tutor of Italian in the Oxford University Language Centre, for so beautifully reading and recording down some extracts from Dante's poetry for us. Martin Kemp, I'm sure, needs no introduction to most of you. He is Professor Emeritus of the History of Art at the University of Oxford and Honorary Fellow of Trinity College, Oxford. He's published extensively on Leonardo, Renaissance art, and the links between art and science in particular. So after his presentation, Martin will be joined by our two other panelists for a three-way conversation, which will range across Dante, science and optics, and depictions of visions of heaven in Renaissance and Baroque art. So I'm now pleased to introduce our other panelists. Simon Gilson is Professor of Italian Studies at Magdalen College, Oxford. His research is focused on Dante, the reception of Dante, and Renaissance Italian literary, cultural and intellectual history. His most recent book is Reading Dante in Renaissance Italy, Florence, Venice and the Divine Poet, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And Alessandra Buccheri is Professor of History of Art at the Accademia di Belle Arti di Palermo. Her main area of research is visual culture in early modern Italy, with a special focus on theatre, architecture and decoration. And her book, The Spectacle of Clouds, 1439 to 1650, Italian Art and Theatre, was published by Ashgate in 2014. Finally, we hope to have about 20 minutes at the end of the event for questions. So if you have any questions which you'd like to put to the panel, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And I will endeavour to raise as many as we have time for with our panel at the end. So I'm now very pleased to hand over to Martin Kemp.
Lucy, thank you very much. At the risk of this becoming a love-in, I should say London Humphreys collectively have done a terrific job with the book. It actually looks and feels very good. It's beautifully produced to the extent that I'd say who really needs the text. Anyway, so thank you for a terrific element of design, editing and so on. Can I welcome old friends, a number of whom I know will be on this, new friends, and particularly friends I don't know I had. Anyway, welcome. Let's see how we get on. Why write the book? Next. I shall be saying next for the slides because I'm far from confident of my keyboard actually operating it properly. Yeah, next. Why write it? Well, obviously the main reason is Dante 700. So that's the trigger for it. And having done Leonardo 2 years ago, I got rather a taste for anniversaries. The Raphael anniversary we sort of missed. It got COVIDed, if there is such a verb, and rather somewhat disappeared. But I'm pleased to say in the book that Raphael emerges in a way as the hero of the book, so it's a belated look back at that. But there are a number of themes which I picked up, which have been recurrent themes in what I've been writing about. I've written a lot about perspective, about naturalistic techniques, about color science in art and so on, all arranged in some way around the naturalistic tradition running from the 15th century up to the late 19th century. And alongside that, that was about light. It's about the science of light. Alongside that, there's been this awareness of divine light and how do you handle divine light in a painting system which relies upon naturalism. I'd written an essay about that some years ago, and this gave me a chance to pick it up and look at the issue of divine light compared with natural light. It also picks up something which I've obviously been involved with via Leonardo, and that is the paragone, the comparison of the various arts, which became something of a kind of courtly sport, a dispute between the various practitioners of the art. We know Leonardo's answer was poetry, Michelangelo's answer rather brusquely in a typical way was sculpture, and of course the poets defended themselves at all. And in juxtaposing Dante, this great magician of words, great magician of descriptive words, it raises the broader question of what can poetry do and what can painting do? And can the painters really ever get close to Dante's evocation of divine light? So that's one of the running themes. And next, the unknown, which Lucy is kind enough to mention, the unknown. What is unknown and how do we know what's unknown, which is an even more pressing problem in modern physics, which I touch on at the end of the book. We're dealing with the unknowns, big unknowns, unknowns of dark matter, dark energy and so on. In Dante, we might say the unknowns was light matter, not dark matter. It's the access to the supreme light, the supreme source of light of God himself, and how far the terrestrial understanding of a human being can transcend the limits of that to get some insight, and how Dante himself particularly did it, and how painters eventually got close to that. Next, please. No, we jumped one. Yeah, just to remind ourselves, we don't Sorry, can we go? Yeah, that's the one I need. We don't really need to remind ourselves of who Dante was, but let's do it nonetheless. Here in Domenico di Michelino's fresco, slightly rather odd style fresco in the Duomo in Florence, in the cathedral in Florence, holding his book at the opening where he's entering the Selva Ascura, the dark wood. On the left, the horrors of Inferno, the struggling mountain in the center of purgatory, climbing eventually to the paradise. Standing outside his beloved Florence, he was exiled, but anachronistically with the Florence dome in completed form. Let's begin with, anyway, at the beginning, and Dante, our Dante, will of the Divina Commedia.
Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Ahi, quanto a dir quale era è cosa dura, esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte che nel pensier rinnova la paura. Tante amare che poco è più morte, ma per trattar del ben che io vi trovai, dirò delle altre cose che vi ho scorte. Io non so ben ridire come ivi entrai, tant'era pien di sonno a quel punto che la verace via abbandonai. Nel mezzo del cammino. Ma poi chi fui al piede di un colle giunto, là dove terminava quella valle che m'avea di paura il cor compunto, guardai in alto e vidi le sue spalle vestite già dei raggi del pianeta che mena dritto altrui per ogni calle. Allor fu la paura un poco queta che nel lago del cor mi era durata la notte che passai con tanta pietà.
If the opening is about entering the dark wood, and Inferno is clearly a place of dark, a place of fear, with what flames occur, consuming flames, through Purgatorio, but Paradiso, we're dealing with light. It probably, in terms of illustrators, is the toughest of all the canticles to deal with. The picturesque sinners and the trials of people in purgatory lend themselves to representation. The succession of divine lights is much more problematic, and we'll see how artists tackled it. Next. The story of Paradiso is of successive waves of light, which Dante struggles to see because he has mere mortal apparatus. He is enabled by Beatrice to see things which we normally wouldn't be able to do. This is the Empyrean. This is the outside the sphere of the fixed stars. This is the flaming paradise occupied by the divine figures. And here Dante is kneeling in front of this blazing vision, and has been allowed, has been permitted to see it, though it relies not upon his natural earthly faculties. This is a very beautiful illustration from an absolutely spectacular set of illustrations of Paradiso by Giovanni di Paolo, Sienese 15th century artist. And he obviously has got resort to the traditional method, that's to say gold, tooled gold, which has this enduring glimmer, enduring glare, and the incised lines giving it a vibration. This is a traditional resource which was to be cast away by the Florentines in the 15th century, and Alberti in his book on painting specifically says you shouldn't use gold, you should imitate gold in paint. And this is in a way the dilemma which I'm dealing with in part in the book. Next. If we look at Piero della Francesca, who's a contemporary of Giovanni di Paolo, one working in Siena in a very traditional but very beautiful, refined way. Piero della Francesca, The New Science of Perspective. He wrote a book on perspective in the Urbino Library, Dei Divina Proporzione, and you've got this painting, the Flagellation of Christ, which is a kind of hymn to Euclid and the Euclidean geometry of the passage of light. In painting terms, the more oriental of the figures are the three disputing on the front right. The dark hat is about as dark as the pigments can go, and the man with the brocaded cloak dress on the right, the sparkling gold, is again the height of where we can go. So this poses the question as to what do you do with divine light in this circumstance? Do you just abandon it? Next, please. I'm posing this question here, by comparing two like things. Giovanni di Paolo, not as a miniaturist, but here as a painter, a large altarpiece. Now, something like 60% or maybe a bit more of that Madonna and Child is gilded, painting on top of the gilding, tooling it, and it's perfectly clear that the Madonna is in this realm of heaven, in the Empyreum, as it were, and is not part of this earthly parade. On the right, Piero della Francesca setting his Madonna and Child, Senigallia Madonna, which was in the town of Senigallia for a time. It's now in the Piazza Ducale in Urbino, setting the Madonna in a very beautiful Renaissance domestic interior. No gold, no gilded gold. There's no painted gold in this picture, but he does something very subtle. And this indicates what very clever artists can do when they have to insinuate divine light into naturalistic frameworks. Next. What he does, and is very extraordinary, he takes the light coming through the window, probably coming through the shutters of a window, and he actually shows you the light beam traversing the air. And a really good illustration, I hope it's visible in this talk. You've got that shaft of light which then hits the wall with what would be called a percussione or splendore, a splendor of reflection. But the light beam is composed of thousands of little tiny spots of very light impasted light. It's the effect which we've all seen probably with light going through the air, which we think is fairly clear, but we then see all these dancing spots of light. Leonardo called them atoms. And Dante uses it at one point, this phenomenon, to describe a cross. He sees a vision of a nebulous, almost intangible cross in the air, and it's actually composed from the light. I'm having to move my thumbnails aside so I can read it. From side to side and from top to bottom moved the lights, sparkling strongly as they met together and passed. Thus are they seen straight and twisted, swift and slow, changing appearance, bodies of minute dimensions, moving through the rays of light, which sometimes streak across the shadow, which for our protection, human ingenuity and skill produced. The shadows produced by human skill and ingenuity are the shadows of the shutters of a window. And as the light pours through the interstices, through the gap in the shutters, you get this effect. It's a very typical Dantesque thing, taking a learned reference. Ptolemy had described this. Ibn al-Haytham in the, and we'll come on to this with Simon later on. Ibn al-Haytham, Islamic optics, described this phenomenon, and Dante picks it up as well. Where did Dante get it from? Where did Piero della Francesca get it from? Well, there are a variety of choices, but it is a highly learned reference to a particular description of a particular phenomenon. Next, please. And maybe the most brilliant of all the evocations of divine light in Dante is the Dream of Constantine in the fresco cycle in San Francesco in Arezzo. The dream of Constantine, he's asleep before the Battle of Milovan Bridge against Maxentius, and has a dream that if he goes into battle with the sign of the cross, under the sign of the cross, he'll be victorious. And we see this rocket ship angel swooping in with a very brilliantly bright but small cross in the angel's hand. And he's done something very clever. The soldiers guarding the emperor or the emperor to be and the page don't see it. This great light and this sudden intrusion of an angel, presumably a noisy angel with beating wings, is invisible and not hearable to them. Whereas the emperor to be sleeps with his eyes closed, very firmly shut, but he sees the vision, he sees the light. One of the characteristics in Dante is that divine light does not obey natural law. And I think this is a very beautiful use of that concept, that this light is deemed to be divine because the ordinary mortals cannot see it. Next. And even if we return to the flagellation, we can see that there's something very subtle going on here. Piero makes demands upon his viewers. He must have relied upon people who looked at things very carefully. Above the statuette, the gleaming statuette on top of the column which Christ is bound to for the flagellation, the coffers above that are flooded with a sudden burst of light, and the beams, the cross beams, cast shadows into the other vaults. So a light is coming in. We can geometrically locate that light as very close to the upraised hand of the flagellator as we look at it on the right. It's back in the picture. It's a specific location. But who sees it? Only Christ sees it. He sees it presumably as a comfort that he has not been abandoned by his Father, that there is a religious presence here in spite of the travails that he is undergoing. A very extraordinary motif. The figures of the flagellators and Pilate don't see it at all. The conspirators outside obviously don't, but again, divine light does not obey natural law, which is absolutely a Dantesque image. Next, please. Of the next generation, one of the most striking of all the instances of divine light behaving in an irrational way, in a non-terrestrial optical way, is the conversion of Saul, the conversion of Saint Paul on the road to Damascus. Christ suddenly appearing with such optical force that he throws Saul off his horse, who bolts into the background and lies on the ground, desperately trying to fend off the divine light. In the Bible, it seems that they hear the voices, but they don't actually see the vision that we see. We're privileged to see the source of the divine light, but Saul falls to the ground and attempts to fend it off. Next, please. And this really goes very nicely with one of the many passages in Dante where Dante in Paradiso attempts to shield himself from the sheer brilliance of divine illumination which strikes him. I felt weighing on my forehead a splendore, much greater than before, so that I raised my hand to the top of my eyes and made myself a shield from the sun's rays to scrape away the visual superfluity. Scrape away, that's nice, isn't it? And of course, that by optical law, his head should be in shadow, which it clearly isn't. Michelangelo, on the whole, uses light as an adjunct to sculptural form, but he has these moments of very brilliant narrative description where light plays a narrative role rather than just an optical role. But the great hero of the Renaissance chapter of the book is Raphael. Next, please. Raphael and Dante, is this a particularly lively topic? There are plenty of signs that Raphael, we think of Michelangelo knowing Dante, we think of Leonardo knowing Dante. which he undoubtedly did, but Raphael less so. But he appears twice. He's the only figure who appears twice in the Stanze delle Segnature, the cycle of frescoes in the Vatican. He appears with poesia, with poetry, Parnassus. He is to the left above the window, the stern-jawed Dante with his laurel wreath, accompanied by the blind Homer and Virgil, who was the guide through the Inferno and Purgatorio. But he also appears in the Disputa, in the fresco devoted to canon law. And he's the only person who appears twice. So Dante appears as a poet, fairly obviously, but he also appears as a theologian, less obviously. But it does suggest that Raphael has a really good grasp of what of Dante's qualities as a theologian, particularly in Paradiso, which is absolutely full of theological wisdom expounded to him by the people, the saints he encounters along the way. His father, next please. No, sorry, could we go back? His father was a very good, competent painter in Urbino, but also a minor poet. He wrote a rhyming chronicle of Federico da Montefeltro's The Duke's Deeds in terza rima, the rhyme with the first and third lines rhyming in each case. And one of his contemporaries referred to him as the second Dante, which is not sustainable, but it does give a sense that Raphael's father had ambitions in this sense, focused upon Dante himself. Raphael was young when he died, but nonetheless, Raphael could not but have been aware of this. And Raphael himself did draft some poetry. I'm not in a position to judge it, but I think Raphael decided himself that his métier was not as a poet, but he wrote some Petrarchian come Dantesque poetry. So it is Dante and Raphael is a rather unexplored topic, I think, but one which bears close looking at. Next, please. Here we are in the Disputa, where we've already seen the image of Dante on the right. Now, this I'm putting up here as a signal because Alessandra and I are going to be looking at this in terms of sacred theatre. So I'm not looking into any detail as we go along, other than to say it's one of the works which has got these amazing cloud putty, gold putty little angels who become evanescent, who merge into the background and merge with light. Anyway, we'll be seeing more of that. Next, please. The putty who merge into light is above all exemplified in the Sistine Madonna. I think the motive of the cloud head putty are probably the angels are invented by Fra Bartolomeo, but it is Raphael who exploits it to the full. Here, using the dark curtain, the silhouetted forms to take the angels' heads from at the fringes, evanescent but still visible as putto heads, as cherubim and seraphim, and then bleaching into this light, which paradoxically seems to give more light than is possible with white lead pigment. An amazing control of tone, and a very Dantesque sense that there is a radiance there which is ultimately unbearable to our sight, or potentially unbearable. Next. And probably the most remarkable, and I think he must have seen Piero della Francesca in his meditations upon this, the release of St. Peter from prison, a sacred theatre of light. On the left, three kinds of light, deliberately showing different sources of light: the taper of the soldier, the moon with a cloud moving across it, and first light of dawn, natural light. Showing three sorts of terrestrial light, outshone very brilliantly, obviously, by the central angel in that in the prison itself, with the guards and the light percussing, bouncing, and doing splendore, splendid splendore on the armor of the soldiers. And the soldiers, in a very Piero della Francesca way, are not aware of what's going on. They miss this extraordinary apparition, which Peter has not yet woken up to. The light is enhanced, obviously, by this very dark grid. And it occurred to me, looking at it, that I wonder if we know he did a drawing for that central section. Would he have squared up that drawing for transfer? That is how he worked, going from smaller drawings to the large cartoon. And if squaring up the drawing, did he suddenly say, "Ah, I see, yeah, I can do that. I can really throw that light into relief by enhancing the squaring lines, as it were, as a grid." Anyway, it's an idea, but Raphael was smart, and it's the sort of thing he could well have done deliberately. And then on the right, as we look at it, the angel takes the bemused Peter. He's very bemused in the Bible. He doesn't really understand what's happening to him. And the soldiers there, again in Piero della Francesca style, are fast asleep and unaware of the divine light, which they're not party to seeing. Next, please. And Raphael's last painting, undertaken for the cathedral in France. Giuliano was the Archbishop of the cathedral at Narbonne, undertaken in competition with Michelangelo. The rival picture was to be painted. The Resurrection of Lazarus in the National Gallery in London was to be painted by Sebastiano, but with Michelangelo's help. Raphael was faced essentially with Michelangelo as a rival, and developed this great composition, extending the Transfiguration from the Transfiguration itself into an event which occurred in the Bible after that, the failure of the earthbound disciples to cure the mad boy, who you can see on the right. And the lower part of the picture, in very stark chiaroscuro, in very starkly modeled in directional natural light. The upper part, a light which obeys its own rules, with Christ with his whitish garment and that white glare. The disciples are the three disciples who accompanied Christ are thrown to the ground by the light, a motive we've already seen, whereas Moses and Ezekiel, as resurrected souls, can look directly at the light. They don't have this problem that they're still encompassed, they're still hindered by the limits of their earthly perception. So there's a very Dantesque thing going on here about the bearability of divine light for ordinary mortals and the accessibility of divine light to those who are in the spiritual realm of heaven. Next, please. It's this vision of divine light developed by Raphael that is picked up very brilliantly by Correggio in Parma. I'm just showing one of the domes here, the second of his great domes, the one in the cathedral, with the Virgin, the Ascension of the Virgin. And we'll see with Alessandra, the Ascension of the Virgin is one of the great subjects of the sacred theatre, which I suspect Correggio would have known. But here, an extreme version of the bleaching of the cloud puto heads into pure light, unrelieved light, with Christ spinning in heaven, awaiting the arrival of his mother. Correggio, I think, must have been to Rome. He clearly got knowledge of Michelangelo. He clearly got knowledge of Raphael, and the Sistine Madonna was in Piacenza, which is whatever the Renaissance equivalent to the A1 was, is not terribly far away. So I think he would have known the Sistine Madonna, and he's adapting this. He's translating it into this, the form of the dome, which of course became the characteristic form of the Baroque. Next, please. I look at a number of the Baroque domes, and for me, this was something of a voyage of discovery. Obviously, I've been to Rome. I've looked at the great vaults and the great domes of the 16th and 17th century, and always thought they're impressive. But as a Anglo-Saxon Protestant atheist, I'd always found them slightly out of tune with what I appreciated in art. Piero della Francesca was much more my person than Pietro da Cortona, who you see here. But entering this through Dante and realizing that you're dealing with extremes of visual experience, the extremity of visual experience, how far can you take it? These Baroque domes, Baroque vaults became quite understandable to me, and they could get inside me in a way which they hadn't previously done. This is Pietro da Cortona in the Chiesa Nuova, these churches sponsored by the great reform movements in the Catholic Church. The Oratorians, St. Filippo Neri is kneeling on the left, and the Jesuits, as we will see with Santignazio. Next, please. And to understand this the assumption of the Virgin, we have to think about it in the church. The central dome, higher than the half dome in which the Ascension of the Virgin is created, is devoted to the Trinity, God the Father, and the dove, which is in the lantern, brilliantly illuminated. The lantern has got its own ring of lights. So you have the dove illuminated above, and you have the Trinity with the saints, with God the Father and Christ. And if you look in the church, and it does require you really to be there, but this illustration gives an idea, you can see the Ascension of the Virgin in the semi-dome at a lower level, and she is ascending, as it were, through the architectural space to the Trinity. So this becomes a multimedia kind of pictorial experience. If you imagine the singing of Maria Assunta Est, then the multimedia quality of this will become very evident. You really need to see these things in the flesh. They're very difficult to photograph, very difficult to come to terms with. They're an immersive experience, and it's one reason I think that these great Baroque painters are less valued in many places than the Renaissance painters, is that to see them, you absolutely can't go to the National Gallery in London or the Metropolitan New York. You need to go to Rome to look at them. Next, please. Multimedia events, of course, the Bernini, about which I'm not going to say very much, but which I do look at in the book. Extraordinary orchestration of light. The painted vault above, which is plastered down so it comes over the window and over the architectural elements, which many people don't look at all that much when they go to Santa Maria della Vittoria and look at the Cornaro Chapel by Bernini. But the light orchestrated as a sensational vision of Saint Teresa being the ecstasy of the thrusting sword, which she describes so remarkably in her description of this event, where her entrails are, as she says, are drawn out by this angel who repeatedly plunges the arrow into her body. Above, if you go above with those gold rays, up behind there's a window which is built out, actually a kind of almost a little bay window, which is built out to create concealed light, which plunges down these gold rays. A notable experience. Bernini, we know, was involved in the design of Sacred Theatre, and he, like other people at the time, used thousands and thousands of light. Anyway, we'll be coming on to this with Alessandra in due course. And next, please. And the greatest of all of them, the protege of Bernini, Giovanni Battista Gauli Batticcio, from Genoa, in the ceiling of the Jesuit church in Rome. This explosion of divine light. It's hugely Dantesque to my eyes and my feeling. I'm not saying he even knows Dante, but as a result of this, as a climax of this kind of painting, of the dissolving of bodies by light, of images by light, it is ultimately a triumph of Dantesque painting, whether he knows Dante or not. Next, please. Santignazio in full color, witnessing the Christogram, the IHS, the name of God, and the Jesuit logo, and this lovely, lovely effect of the tumbling putty all wriggling in the divine light and ultimately being bleached into nothingness by the radiance of Christ's name. Next, please. And to finish, Dante will read the last sections of the Paradiso, which get to the point where Dante, even Dante's alta fantasia, as he describes it, even Dante's powers of verbal account collapse in the face of the final vision. This will give you a sense, it's leading up to it, and at the end of the talk, at the end of this discussion, we will have the very last lines of Paradiso, but this is leading up to that final vision.
Sì sol di me quel che creasti novellamente, amor che il ciel governi, tu il sai che col tuo lume mi levasti. Quando la rota che tu sempiterni desiderato, a sé mi fece atteso con l'armonia che tempri e discerni, parvemi tanto allor del cielo acceso della fiamma del sol, che pioggia o fiume, lago non fece alcun tento disteso. La novità del suono e il grande lume di lor cagion m'accesero un disio, mai non sentito di contanto acume. Ond'ella, che vedea me sì come io, acquietarmi l'animo commosso, pria ch'io a dimandar, la bocca aprio e cominciò. Tu stesso ti fai grosso col falso immaginar, sì che non vedi ciò che vedresti se l'avessi scosso. Tu non sei in terra sì come tu credi, ma Folgore, fuggendo il proprio sito, non corse come tu che adesso riedi.
Thank you very much. We now move into, with Simon, Dante scholar, to thinking a bit about Dante, about optics and these issues which I've dealt with, but Simon's book really is the definitive discussion of them. Simon, Dante is one of those figures that you can look at from all sorts of angles, and you can get a characterization of him which is very different. How can we read the optics and the science in Dante? How does it mesh with the great vision that Dante has?
Thanks, Martin. And first of all, congratulations on your magnificent book. It's beautiful to look at, beautiful to hold and see. And you know, you in one chapter put together, wonderfully titled Dante's Dazzle, put together a whole range of passages, especially from Paradiso, that just give a sense of just how multifaceted and complex Dante's kind of imagination is there. So, I mean, optics for Dante means something, as you know, and as you say, well in the book, it's at several points, something much more than we understand by optics today. So it's a whole kind of science of vision, and it's potentially a science that encompasses geometry, anatomy, other branches of learning. I think that's representative of a certain kind of mental habit that transfers over to the poetry of Dante constantly. And I think one of his big characteristics is that kind of incredible range of interests and his desire to want to kind of cut through what we would view as borders between scientific disciplines and literary ones, humanistic ones. So at one level, and I think, I mean, you know, Dante is a great intellectual, but he's able to render all those intellectual interests into the most amazing range, extraordinary range of language, of metaphors, of similes, of passages in which one has great characterization and dialogue between characters. So he's able to actually bring those ideas to life as well within the text too. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, we know that medieval optics is actually an incredibly complicated science drawing on a very wide range of traditions. How you managed to kind of, what were your principles of selection in kind of bringing together a chapter where you talked about, well, really two main figures, Alhazen, Ibn al-Haytham, and John Peckham as well.
Have the next slide, please. Is that
yeah,
we've mopped that up. Thank you. Yeah, two eyeballs. Ibn al-Haytham, or al-Hazen as he's generally known in the West and the left, 16th century edition of the great medieval Islamic scholars book, De Aspectibus, as it was known in the Latin West, on appearances. I think one of the great books, one of the greatest of all books on optics. And on the right, John Peckham, who you mentioned, Simon, the Archbishop of Canterbury, his rather succinct, Alhazen was anything but succinct, Peckham's Perspectiva Communis, which became a kind of textbook, was it gathered together and summarized and made sense of a whole lot of complex things. And the eyes, this is not the eye with a focusing mechanism, as we know, with a lens. It's a very elaborate setup of refractory spheres of humors which reflect the light in diverse ways. I came at this, I've come at many things in the Renaissance via Leonardo, and Leonardo started with a very simple notion of what sight was, and when he came across the medieval philosophy of light, and in the 16th century an Italian translation of at least a part of Ibn al-Haytham must have been around, he realized how complicated light was, and that seeing was not a straightforward business. You know, I think, Simon, one of the things I felt reading Dante, and I'm absolutely not an expert on Dante, was there was a profound affinity that in many people you can say, oh, well, this poet is influenced by science, or he's influenced by this or influenced by that. With Leonardo and Dante, somehow or other, they seem to have all this what we regard as diverse things going around, diverse concepts, diverse subjects, and yet they unify them by some kind of spontaneity where they don't seem to be different areas. It's not one that A influences B or B influences C, but A and B are part of a single unified thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's very, I mean, yeah, I agree. And I think that's very interesting. Certainly Dante has that kind of quality, even though so much earlier, of wanting to potentially absorb almost encyclopedically all knowledge of humans and nature that there possibly is. And yet to do that with an incredible lightness and delicacy and range in the poetry, where at times you don't, sometimes you do in Dante feel that learning, but very often you don't feel the learning at all, but it's underpinning a gesture or a glance, or one of the many descriptions of how Dante, who of course is the major protagonist in his poem, sees at the same time. So yeah, no, I absolutely agree.
Yeah, there's a very nice, I looked at the Convivio. One advantage of coming to Dante as a non-Dante specialist, I don't know what's minor and what's major. Convivio, the banquet, is sometimes referred to a minor work, whereas I thought it was awesomely good. And he writes his own commentary on it. And there's a lovely description of this, basically the structure of the eye, envisaging that it was a kind of concave mirror-like surface inside, which is where the sight was registered. But he has a lovely passage where he looks at how Cupid fires his arrows at us, and he fires his arrows straight down this centric ray, because one of the dilemmas of the optics is you've got light coming in from all sorts of different angles. So how, without a focusing mechanism, do you make sense of this? And the answer was, it's the ones that come down perpendicularly on the surface of the eye, and above all, what Alberti called the prince of the rays, the one that comes straight down. And this is the the way in which Cupid shoots his dart into the eyes of the smitten man. A lovely, lovely thing. And it takes a real genius to take what is a kind of rather dry optical theory about refraction and seeing and turn it into love poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And that whole idea of the central ray, and that central ray acting in a more charged way, but then Dante building that into it's almost like a ballistics of love at some level, is really, really important. And again, it's interesting that Dante was writing in a tradition of earlier love poetry where arrows were going the other ways too, quite often out of the eye and penetrating and being fired into other lovers. He combines elements of both theories, the intromission and the extramission, I think. But yeah, primarily, many of his scientific and other models stress objects as geometrical arrays of light coming and color coming into the eye and being perceived that way. But I don't know if you want to say more on extramission and intromission, give it slightly more technical terms, or even about light and seeing, Martin.
Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, one of the key themes, as I indicated, was what Dante experiences in Paradiso. The optical phenomena don't obey the natural rules, and this is again Giovanni di Paolo, who's not quite understood what's going on, but he makes a fair shot at it. This, I think, is just fascinating. You're probably better equipped to say what's happening here than I am. But...
So we're in the second canto of Paradiso. Dante floating there with Beatrice. Beatrice is trying to explain to Dante, in effect, the whole structure of the universe, and Dante's like a poor student struggling over a problem, which is the problem of why the moon looks spotty. He doesn't really understand why that is. He thinks it may have a physical explanation, maybe due to different material strata on the moon. And Beatrice goes into a very long discussion where she treats him like an ineffectual, poor little child at several points. And part of the discussion destroys Dante's own views. I mean, so again, it's in some ways it's quite funny, because Dante is showing himself as a character in 1300 understanding nothing, because he's thinking too materially, he's thinking too scientifically, too physically. And the three mirrors that you can see in the center of the picture there are part of that refutation, where Beatrice actually constructs an experiment to make Dante understand how his explanation, his physical explanation of the strata on the moon can't be the case. If a light is illuminated behind him, different brightnesses are seen in the mirror as a way of modeling what Dante thinks, but proving that that's actually wrong. The ultimate explanation is actually to fit really centrally with the themes of your book, Martin, is not a physical explanation, not an explanation based on the physical behavior of light at all, but an explanation that's based on a whole understanding, a metaphysical understanding of the cosmos, in which light is differentiated from one heaven, the eighth heaven, as power, and that power is transmitted by the angels. And the description of the two characters that are forged there is actually a simile from the canto that talks about the transmission of angelic power being like the art of the blacksmith at his forge. So a very, very subtle reading of, but the explanation is a metaphysical explanation that's part of angelology and cosmology and the metaphysical system. So it's a wonderful demonstration of how Dante's operating at multiple levels, but absolutely all about light.
Yeah. No, Beatrice I find rather intimidating in a way. I mean, she destroys his argument by dint of terrestrial optics, and then says, "Well, it's not even in the right zone of argument. You're not the right field. Your experiments, esperienza, is you can't even look at that." Could we have the next slide, please? And this is the last of Giovanni di Paolo's illustrations. It's not the last vision in the Paradiso, but he doesn't go all the way to the final vision of the Trinity in our effigy. He stops rather wisely at this point. The radiant Virgin with these little gold gilded spots upon her dress, which make her even more radiant than she would normally be. But very oddly, the ship of Argus and Neptune. What on earth are these doing?
Well, again, I mean, again, it's remarkable. Giovanni di Paolo has taken just again one terzina, one group of 3 lines, a simile, where Dante is describing in retrospect as the poet his emotions, his failing vision, his extraordinary vision of the light of the Godhead at this point, and saying, well, I had an experience of oblivion that is equivalent to the thousands of years that have elapsed since the Argonauts first sailed. It's like a point compared to the thousands of years since they've sailed. So there's no comparison at all. It's a remarkable, puzzling, arresting image that gets, commented on today, picked up even by contemporary poets in interesting ways. So it's extraordinary that the artist has placed that in there. I mean, I'm interested in the image of the Virgin as well there, Martin. Have you got things to say on that effulgence?
No, I'm very happy for you to do that.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the first part of the canto is a prayer to the Virgin Mary. Actually, within that, she's described as a flame, as a torch. So luminous terminology is used in relation to her. It's interesting that Beatrice is still here, because actually in the text, Dante is now being guided by Saint Bernard. You point this out in the book at this point. What we don't have is the final vision in the canto, which is the vision, and again, you document it in several illustrations in the book too. I'm not sure whether we'll see one in a moment, which is where Dante, again, using optical and light imagery, talks about a final vision of God in a triune aspect, as the Trinity, of 3 circles of 1 circumference, with our effigy, nostra effigie, present in the central circle.
Yeah, that's incredible. The Paradiso is difficult to illustrate in a sense because it's a very abstract thing. He can describe it and he can insinuate it into our mind and vision, but the figures, until I really grappled with Paradiso this time, I'd not realized that the figures don't appear as bishops with mitres and robes and so on. That most of the illustrators do that. Next, please. Dante, interestingly, and his very remarkable unfinished, uncoloured drawings for Lorenzino de' Medici, for Lorenzo e Magnifico's cousin. Dante is the only illustrator historically who uses that level of abstraction, where the figures, the orbiting stars in the bottom right, one of them is labelled Pietro, and they appear as talking flames rather than as sort of looking like flesh and blood figures. And it's very daring of Dante to use that level of abstraction, of not following the normal trend you would do. Dante and Beatrice, of course, appear as linear figures, discussing things and debating and so on. But it is an act of, even if it was coloured, it's still an act of extraordinary abstinence.
Yeah, Botticelli is remarkable, and I think, you know, I mean, again, I think one thing the book shows well is just how extraordinary his kind of close reading of Dante is, because there are times at which the Paragone remains separated in the book, that there's not necessarily a direct influence on particular artists, but at times there definitely is, and your talk earlier was showing how that works strongly for Raphael. It works in interesting ways for Leonardo too, but I mean, I think these images really show that remarkably. I mean, yeah, I can't remember, Martin, you have a way of describing that kind of, that rarefaction that Botticelli has, and the degree of kind of abstraction he uses.
Yeah. I don't remember myself, I have to read the book. Let's now, next please, and next let's pick up here with Alessandra, because with Sacred Theatre. And when we were discussing this, you sent me this quotation, and I thought, wow, I knew it in a sense, but I wonder if you'd like to read it out, and we'll see where it takes us.
Yeah. Pareva me che nube ne coprisse, lucida, spessa, solida e pulita, quasi adamante che lo sol ferisse. Per entro sé l'eterna margarita ne ricevette, come acqua recepe raggio di luce, permanendo unita. Good evening, everyone. Sorry, and I want to thank Martin for his wonderful book that gave me the opportunity to think about light and clouds. And in fact, here Dante describes the first heaven similar to a cloud, even though it's not a cloud at all, because we know that clouds are part of the material world and they're not supposed to be in the heaven. And in fact, as Simon mentioned before, and Martin as well, we've seen the Botticelli's drawing that are trying to describe something that is undescribable, unpaintable, so it's very hard to think about ways of representing heaven. And certainly clouds are, in a sense, a perfect medium to represent the heavens, because and Dante provides here a very good image of heaven as a cloud. He uses the adjective thick and solid, and at the same time shining and polished. And clouds, in fact, can be very different in terms of how we can represent them. They can be dark, solid and thick. They can be transparent, they can be shining, and light can go through them, a different range of light. So this is something that artists could not ignore. And even this image that Dante provides, I think it's quite important for the artistic tradition. And if you look at the visual tradition, the use of clouds to represent the heavens became more and more common starting from the 1400s. Next, please. And here we have a very nice Raphaelesque example of this representation of the light of heaven that becomes much more visible if we use some kind of cloud-like material, this thick, solid, shining, polished thing. And here we see inside this cloud-like material also all these nice faces of putters that are, of course, the angelic hierarchies. And this is an invention of Fra Bartolomeo, as Martin said, that Raffaello, of course, changed and developed quite brilliantly. Next, please. And I don't know, Martin, if you want to add something about, sorry, maybe back back to the Madonna Sistina, please. Yeah, sorry, Martin. Yeah,
keep going. Yes, doing well.
Okay, okay. So next, in this different way of using clouds for representing the heavens, sacred theatre had a very important role. Also because, let's not forget, one of the issues is materiality. We need something where the actors can stand. We need something through which we can build the heavens. And so the sacred theater started to use what was very common in the Middle Age, like artificial clouds made of wooden platform and wadding covering this wooden platform in order to lift up and down angels of sacred character from an artificially built heaven. This is, in this woodcut, that is dating from the 1500s, so it's quite late. It's the first visual representation of the heaven machinery, what Vasari calls the ingegni del Paradiso. But this kind of machinery had been used for a very long time, probably starting from the early 400, 1400, even slightly before, and it developed, the technology developed a lot throughout the century. And here we can see this beautiful mandorla, where Gabriel stays and is standing on a platform that is covered with wadding. And we have other two angels that are accompanying him. And if you look above, there is an opening, a circle that is representing the heavens, and inside you see the different circle. And there's also the circle were covered with clouds according to the description. Of course, the woodcut has to be simplified. And in the foreground, you see again Gabriel talking to the Virgin Mary and giving her the message from God. But the most important part for us is the background with this beautiful machinery representing heaven. Next, please. Here we have a more detailed description of the mandorla on the right hand side. It's a drawing by Bonaccorso Ghiberti from the mid 1400. He was the nephew of the more famous Lorenzo. And this drawing is important because it's describing the mechanism of the mandorla. You see this mandorla with these very tiny lamps, candles that are inside the iron cylinders. These cylinders could move up and down, and when it was used for the Annunciation feast, so for is a lift for the angel, for Gabriel, to go up and down, as we saw in the woodcut. And talking about clouds and light, so the mandorla was covered with wadding, and so it looked like a cloud surrounding the angel. And then this little cylinder would be moved down at the moment in which Gabriel arrived on the ground, and suddenly was all lit. So again, you see this beautiful interaction between light and clouds. And on the left, we see this was a portable cloud. It was carried on the shoulders during the processions. And you see again the mandorla, and you see this very nice representation of the lights with these sun rays. And at the top we see this iron belts that were all covered with clouds, and they would be there to make the angel. It was a security belt to prevent the angel from falling down. Next, please.
The amount of lights they used was just extraordinary.
Yeah, from the records we have records that describe thousands and thousands of lamps, that also oil lamps and candles.
The health and safety people were not on the job.
Yeah, I think the accidents. I mean, we have a few records of accidents that occurred. Sometimes the whole machinery burns. So, and as I said, the theatrical performances, sacred theatrical performances, were very important to add to the imagination of the artist the idea that they could represent, in fact, heavens by means of light, but also clouds. And often painters were involved with the design of the machinery. For example, this is a good example, Masolino da Panicale, we know from the records that was indeed involved in painting the cloud and for applying azure and fine gold, for painting the angels who turn around the cloud. So we have this interesting record. And we can see here the pinnacle of a major altarpiece by Masolino, in fact. And here, you know, the mandorla is interesting because it's made of light and seraphim and cherubim. However, it's quite solid at the same time. It's quite thick and solid, like the iron mandorla of the Annunciation Feast. Assumption Feast as well, because the same mandorla was used for the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. And all the angels that are surrounding the mandorla, some of them are kind of holding the mandorla as it was, again, material and not only light. And if you also see under every angel, we have a very tiny slim cloud sustaining, lifting up the angels as well. So we have this very subtle reference to the theatrical performance that are quite interesting to spot. Next, please. And this wonderful painting by Botticini is considered one of the most evident example of the influence of this Ingegni del Paradiso, cloud heaven machinery, on painting. In fact, talking about materiality of the heaven, you see this heaven that is opening and it's like cut through the sky. It's like it's very thick and solid. And then we have all these hierarchies of angels with very thin clouds underneath, and this the shine and the use of God. And on this, maybe Martin, I give you. I pass to you a comment.
Yeah, it's interesting when a number of painters in the 15th century who normally wouldn't use gold, when they're faced with the Paradisi, they're faced with the heavens, they do so. Next, please. Botticelli, Coronation of the Virgin, in one of these little type dome spaces, and the so-called mystic nativity on the right. In both cases, the resort is made to gold, although it's not a canonical thing to do it, not in a sense an obviously approved thing to do at this time. And next. And the Raphael then fits into that very well. Once we've got this sense of how the machinery works, then we're able to look at that Raphael as a piece of sacred theatre, very complicated with all sorts of different optical effects, not only gilding and tooled gilding, but cloud heads, rather solid ones, aren't they, Alessandra, at the bottom? Yeah. The disciples have got a reassuringly solid platform of clouds.
Yeah, and also the combination of platform and then single clouds where Jesus Christ is sitting. Usually, we could also have a platform cloud without the mandorla, only the platform lifting up and down the character, and also the other layer of heaven above Christ, with again these beautiful angels that are embedded inside this thick, solid, shining and polished clouds. I love all this adjective that Dante uses in the Divine Comedy.
We should probably press on since we're
Yeah, I really wanted to show this because, again, all the tradition of the religious theater and all this Ingegni del Paradiso was imported in the court theater, thanks to Vasari first, and then Bernardo Buontalenti and Giulio Parigi. And especially Bernardo Buontalenti was famous to be very good with clouds and able to design and perform scene a tutto cielo, all sky scenery. And here we see again this beautiful opening of heaven, and in the background a lot of light. We will see there is a description that we're going to read about this intermezzo. Oh, I can't read it through because of little icons, so we just need to get rid of the icons. Okay, so I read through. This is a description made of the performance, contemporary to the performance. And as the sky opened, inside of it, in the highest of places, an assembly of gods was seen. The whole scene was covered with sun rays, and were it not for its splendor being obscured by some vapors, the eye could have not borne for long the intensity of its light. Once the sky opened, the whole scene was covered with the splendor of the rising sun mixed with those vapors, and so on. So again, we see this beautiful combination of clouds and light, and this beautiful, and this idea that the different ranges of light have their climax in the concept of splendor, splendore. There is exactly the word that Dante uses in the Divine Comedy. In fact, when I read Martin's book, for me it was like a revelation, because I didn't know that Dante was using the word splendore so much, and it's a word that recurs a lot in the description of the theatrical performances. And here we also have the Dantesque idea, the Dantesque motif of the eye that could not borne the intensity of light. That is, again, it's something that came from Dante and from also the studies of medieval optics and so on. It probably became something that remained inside the literature and theater, and some idea that everybody had when dealing with the divine light. The divine light is so strong, so splendid, that the eye cannot bear it. So it's again a Dantesque idea.
Looking at this, we're not far. This is Giovanni di San Giovanni. We're coming into this area of the dome designs, and the great proponents of dome design. Pietro da Cortona worked as a theatrical designer, Bernini already did, and Giovanni di San Giovanni, who's not so well known. Could you, just as a last example, say a little bit about Giovanni di San Giovanni? And
yeah, Giovanni San Giovanni is quite an unknown painter for not specialists, but he's an amazing painter, and he moved from Florence to Rome, and in Florence he worked with Giulio Parigi, so he was very well aware of the spectacles that were organized by Giulio Parigi on the stage of the Medici Theatre. And this beautiful fresco painting describing the glory of the saints is very much composed and organized like the cloud scenery that were performed on the Medici Theatre. So we have all these different platform clouds, and then clouds rising up and down in the middle, and different levels, different level of light, intensity of light. So if we go, the next one is, this is Pietro da Cortona, who was a pupil, or Comodi, that was a pupil of Cigoli, that worked again in Florence. They're all Florentine. Pietro da Cortona is from Cortona, but he studied with a Florentine painter. And they're all connected to theater. And also Pietro da Cortona organized theatrical performance in Rome. And at the left, we have the beautiful drawing by Pietro da Cortona for a feast of the 40 hours. That was an amazing feast. That it was an all ephemeral apparatus was constructed inside the church for 40 hours, the 40 hours between the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. So from the Holy Friday until the Sunday, the Easter Sunday. And this apparatus again was organized, the Eucharist was in the middle. And then all around we had a lot of circle of clouds representing the heavens again. And then there was a big triumphal arch, and with more clouds above that remind a bit of the Cappella Cornaro by Bernini. And Bernini also organized and designed 40 ore, 40 hours feast. And here we have in the middle again this very strong light that surrounds the Eucharistia. And we know from the records again that the number of candles that was used for this 40 hours apparatus was incredible, like 3,000–4,000 candles all together lit at the same time. And so again, this combination of light and clouds that come up when dealing with heaven in painting or theater. Next, I don't remember what's next. Maybe
we should probably open it up for questions. So
yeah, this is just yeah, this is clear. It's the Medici theater intermezzi compared to the fresco painting, and then the last one, it's Martin, the one by Basiccia. Next, please. That you already mentioned here. I think that is very much composed as a 40 hours feast with this incredible strong point in the middle from which light is spreading and be surrounded by clouds and saints and angels.
fascinating.
Yes.
Thanks very much. Let's open it up to questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have 3 questions so far. The first one is, how directional is divine light?
In theory, it's not directional, because it convey its own rules. But the microphone's working, is it? Yeah. Okay. In theory, it shouldn't be directional at all, and it doesn't obey rules, just as Michelangelo can't fend it off. But in fact, in showing how it operates, it almost always goes outwards in radiating rays like the spokes of a wheel. In the great fresco of Pozzo in Santignazio in Rome, which I look at, the light bounces around. It comes off God the Father and the Son, and it hits the Santignazio, who then radiates it to the 4 corners of the earth. So in practice, the light is almost always shown as radiating in straight lines, which was very much the medieval doctrine of the multiplication of species, that light came out like rippled out from this central core according to a set of raggi, a set of rays. So in theory, it's not directional at all, but in order to become comprehensible to the person who looked at it, it tends to do directional things. It's quite an interesting topic. I hadn't considered that.
Lovely, thank you. The next question is for you, Martin. How do you think Piero della Francesca achieves that sense of stillness in his frescoes, iconographically and technically? I can think of many reasons why there is that stillness, but would be curious to see what you think.
Yeah, the John Sherman, who I studied with the graduate studies at the Courtauld, he admired Piero della Francesca, but he rather, in his typical act of individualism, he said he much preferred or much admired Benozzo Gozzoli, of course, who is very detailed and with much more fussy visually. Piero had a great sense of, Kenneth Clark compared him with the great Greek sculptors, which he wouldn't have known, but there is that sense of telling the sacred stories in a very contemplative, very measured manner, where even the battles in the Arezzo frescoes are quite rhetorically conducted, compared, say, with Uccello, where there's much more the chaos of battle in it. So he's aiming for that, the narrative, but overlain by a kind of spiritual serenity. We don't have any evidence of him doing that, but that's how I would read it. There are artists who do that. Andrea del Sarto in Florence later does very dramatic stories, but almost as if they're occurring in the head rather than occurring through sheer physical bravura. It is a very extraordinary way of painting, and obviously the divinity of the Euclidean geometry is a key element in not just the form of the painting, but its content. It's the divinity of the seen thing, as it were. Sorry, that's not a very good answer, but it's a difficult question.
Thank you. We have a question about optics. The question is, you mentioned John Peckham's theories on optics, which might have influenced Dante. Are there other authors that are likely to have shaped Dante's theories on optics? Roger Bacon, Aristoteles, anyone else? Perhaps one for Simon.
And I'll pass it then immediately to Simon, who's written very well about this. By talking about Ibn al-Haytham and Peckham, I wasn't saying these are books that Dante digested and admired specifically, but they're representative of the trends. But Simon really knows about this.
I'm muting myself. No, it's a good question. It's not absolutely clear. I think probably unlikely that Dante knew the most technical sources like Alhazen, Peckham, Vitolo, a Silesian scholar, or Roger Bacon, the English Franciscan. But he certainly, there's many of those theories, and probably the work of Alhazen were digested in other ways, in encyclopedias, in other kinds of philosophical commentaries that Dante certainly would have read, especially on Aristotle, as the questioner suggests. And optics was kind of a bit everywhere and in the air. It was one of those sciences that lots of people picked up on. So preachers would talk about, really quite complex optical issues or effects within their sermons as ways of talking about how divine grace worked or the problems of human sight. So I think those ideas were in the mix much more than we might have thought, even at a really very technical level as well. So Dante would of course have done some learned reading, but there would be that general environment as well. Martin, back to you.
Great, thank you.
I'm happy with that. The situation is not unlike Leonardo in a way that people of this intellectual caliber can get more out of general and suggestive texts than most people get out of their close reading of very detailed texts. So what they can build is amazing on the basis of enough learning to give them a foundation, and they can take it from there.
Lovely, and I think we've got time for one final question. There's a question about Giotto. The question says, I wonder about Giotto, whether he actually met Dante or not. To what extent did the poet's vision influence the painters? It seems it took a few decades for Dante's influence to generalize in the pictorial field, or maybe Giotto was too down to earth. Yeah. Martin.
My chapter on the Renaissance artist begins with Giotto and in the Scrovegni Chapel, which is a very Dantesque image, very self-consciously artisty as well, just as Dante is a very self-conscious poet. Not because I think there's any influence on them, but they're both drawing upon the same sources for the vision of heaven, the hierarchies of angels, the Christ in majesty, and so on. So there's a very strong parallel. There is generally, there's no evidence that the two men met, but Dante, of course, refers to Giotto. There's a famous passage where he's looking at the passing of pride and the passing of fame, and once the cry was Cimabue, but now the cry is Giotto. That's not a particularly good paraphrase of it. So he refers in himself to Giotto as having superseded his predecessor, and that's a motif of passing fame, which Simon will know more about than I do. And there is said to be a fresco portrait of Giotto in the Bargello, but I'm not persuaded that that's the one that the early sources actually refer to. But that's rather a contentious matter. But they both represent peaks, and they're parallel peaks, I think, rather than interacting peaks, if peaks can interact. Simon, do you want to say any more about that?
No, I think that's a thoughtful set of comments. I think there's a danger of just assuming they knew each other, and sometimes
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we've reached the end of our time. So I'm going to round it up there. Thank you very much to our three speakers, Martin Kemp, Simon Gilson and Alessandra Buccheri. Thank you to all of our participants, and I'm sorry we haven't been able to address all the questions. There was a question about how people could watch this lecture. It has been recorded and it will be available to watch on our YouTube channel. We will email you with a link to the recording when it's available. If you've been inspired by this talk, do go and buy the book. It's available at special discount until the end of the month. If you want to hear more about Lund Humphrey's art history books, do also sign up to our email newsletter on our website. Thank you very much for attending, and happy Dante Day.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the
Thank
people.
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Nella profonda e chiara sussistenza dell'alto lume parvermi tre giri di tre colori e di una contenenza, e l'un dall'altro come iri da iri parea riflesso, e il terzo parea foco che quinci e quindi ugualmente si spiri. Oh, quanto è corto il dire e come fioco al mio concetto, e questo a quel chi vidi è tanto che non basta a dicer poco. Oh, luce eterna che sola in te sidi, sola t'intendi, e da te intelletta e intendente te ami e aridi. Quella circulazione che si concetta pareva in te come lume riflesso dagli occhi miei alquanto circospetta, dentro da sé del suo colore stesso mi parve pinta della nostra effigie, perché il mio viso in lei tutto era messo. Qual geometra che tutto s'affigge per misurarlo cerchio e non ritrova, pensando, quel principio onde egli indige, tal era io quella vista nova. Veder voleva come si convenne l'imago al cerchio e come vi si indova. Ma non er da ciò le proprie penne, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un fulgore in che sua voglia venne. Ah, l'alta fantasia qui mancò possa, ma già volgeva il mio disio il velle, sì come rota chi igualmente è mossa, l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle.